you for joining us at this early morning session, first session of the conference here in Montreal. It's wonderful to be here, and it is a really great pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished speakers. And I do not use that word lightly at all today. We are very lucky to have some wonderful people giving papers in today's session, which is entitled Women and War in France's Long 19th Century. I will introduce the speakers individually before they come up to the podium. And so I'll begin by introducing our first speaker. Margaret H. Darrow is professor of history at Dartmouth College. She received her PhD from Rutgers, where also I received my bachelor's degree from Rutgers. And she is the author of many, many articles and other kinds of publications. Here today I'll just mention her two books, French Women and the First World War, which were published by Berg in 2000, and Revolution in the House, Family, Class, and Inheritance in Southern France, 1775 to 1825, a book I very much appreciated as I work on that same period. Anyway, Peggy, thank you.
Now let's see if I can get this to, whoops. Okay, now. How do I get it to go full screen?
F5 should do it. F5 should do it.
F5. Good. And let's see, now for advancing it, I probably, what do I do?
The arrow keys.
We can skip forward.
Ah, okay, okay, good. So, we're set. Okay, Les Enfants Héroïques. In Les Enfants Héroïques, 1917 patriotic anthology, its author, Abbé Stéphane Coubet, entitled one of his anecdotes, The Little Sisters of Joan of Arc. He goes on to say, we want to save France like Joan of Arc did. This was the idea that had long haunted the minds of three young girls of Perpignan. For they stated later, the salvation of France is well worth this sacrifice. So one morning they left on foot. They walked the whole day. It was hard, but enthusiasm kept them going. They saw victory already flying over their heads. But the police ran after them, and that same evening brought them back home. A beautiful dream died. Sad times when we must clip the wings of victory and her little messengers. In 1914, stories of women and girls attempting to join the French army made the rounds. Michel Corday, in his diary, recorded in October, one of these newspapers published brief paragraphs of Paris laundress who had fought disguised as a zouave, a woman who, dressed in her husband's uniform, reported for duty in his place. In both of these cases, the supposed soldier's sex was soon revealed, and she was dispatched home. Only the Moroccan Fatima, who bundled her long hair into a turban to join her Spahi husband, was allowed to remain with the French army. In all of these tales, specifics are few, names mostly absent. They are vestigial remains of a narrative that had once been quite popular in France for over a century. The story of the Femme-Soldat. Originating in Greek mythology, it acquired a specifically French identity in the story of Joan of Arc, then experienced a revival during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and gained popularity in the 19th century in plays, in music hall reviews, illustrated magazines, and children's books. The Commune, however, seriously imperiled the story. It survived, but in a weakened form, and the First World War finished it off. French women's heroism was demilitarized. Women warriors were English, Russian, Moroccan, Serbian, but not French. French women nursed. I have found only one full-fledged story of a femme-soldat in the First World War, an obscure novel published serially in 1915-16. And as I will conclude, it writes the genre's obituary by declaring itself to be unbelievable. Although the myth of the Amazons formed the deep background of women warrior tales, these stories in the 19th century are of individual women rather than a female army. A good example is the story of Virginie Guesquière of 1912. that was repeated and embellished throughout the century. According to later versions, Virginie enlisted in 1806 to defend France by replacing her twin brother who, quote, she judged too weak to survive the rigors of military service, end quote. Presenting his papers and disguised in his clothes, she was incorporated into the army and served for 6 years, rising to the rank of sergeant without anyone discovering her sex. The central episode of her story was her rescue of her wounded commanding officer. In 1912, she herself was wounded, her sex was finally discovered, and she was discharged. Napoleon himself awarded her the Légion d'honneur, the first woman to receive the award, so acclaimed the accounts. Fans of Disney movies may recognize elements of the Moulin story here. That Chinese ballad from the early Middle Ages was not known in the West until the late 19th century, so this is not a case of Virginie being copied from Moulin. But it does show how general these kind of tales were. A girl goes to war in male disguise, replacing to replace or to avenge a beloved man, an elderly father, or a cowardly or sickly brother, a dead or wounded husband or lover. She fights heroically, but her sex is eventually discovered, often after she is wounded, and then she either dies or is sent home. The story hovers between gender transgression and reaffirmation. The woman renounces her femininity in order to dress and act like a man, and she succeeds. However, her renunciation is temporary, and it is in the service of patriarchal values. Filial piety in the Moulin story, loyalty to the true monarch for Joan of Arc, patriotism for Virginie Guesquière. The woman warrior's exceptional sacrifice underlies the paramount importance of these values, rather than making any claims for a reevaluation of women's status. As Julie Wheelwright argues in Amazons and Military Maids, the stories both, quote, disrupt and ultimately clarify often fluid or evolving concepts of sexual difference, end quote. How a society retells the story is, quote, a useful indicator of a society's changing understanding of gender, end quote. In the 19th century, gender norms were increasingly unstable. Woman warrior stories helped Europeans to work out the implications of these changes, to explore, but also to contain the threat to social order. These stories experienced a marked revival in both popular culture of music hall routines, songs, plays, articles, illustrations in magazines, but also in higher cultural forms such as opera and painting. And they took on a variety of new elements. In Germany, for example, the stories tended to conclude with the violent reassertion of patriarchy as the woman warrior was raped, killed, or committed suicide. No such violent resolutions transformed the stories in France. In France, instead, French iterations of the tale used humor, for example, in music hall routines and cartoons. Also feminization, converting the Femme-Soldat into a nurturer, and also skepticism to defuse the increasingly troubling image of the woman warrior as the century went on. In her discussion of the Moulin story, Landong points out that legendary women warriors never fought for women's rights. They were intended to inspire men. A modern example is the famous Russian Women's Battalions of Death, created by the revolutionary government in 1917 to shame men who were deserting in droves to return to their duty. This is also the lesson nailed home in the stories of Revolutionary War, women soldiers in the Revolutionary Wars. Liberté Barrault, for example, depicted here. According to the first report of her story in the Recueil des Actions Héroïques et Civiques of the year 2, Rose, called Liberté Barrault, volunteered in 1792 along with her husband and brother and went to battle at their sides. When both of her men were struck down, she pressed forward nonetheless until victory was achieved. Quote, the patriotism of Citizeness Barrault and her attachment to military discipline triumphed over love as earlier they had triumphed over nature, reported the Auch Register in 1793. Even clearer is the story of Théophile Fernig, who, confronting fleeing troops, as you see in this illustration from textbook, in the Battle of Nailvender, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Nailvender in 1793, confronted them with a raised sword, unbuttoning her tunic, exposing her bosom and therefore her sex, saying, "Strike if you will, if you dare. It is a woman who reminds you of your honor." And here you have, strike if you dare. And then there was the most popular story of a femme-soldat in the middle of the 19th century was of Thérèse Figure, nicknamed Madame Saint-Jean. Although her exploits took place during the Napoleonic Wars, her account appeared only in the 1840s and differs considerably from the patriotic propaganda of the 1790s. Figure's As Told To memoir is a picaresque adventure story combining the heroic with the comedic, and the latter focused on transvestism. As Figure crosses Europe with the Grande Armée, local girls keep falling in love with this sprightly dragoon, whom they take to be a young man, and all sorts of comic complications ensue. Figure's story exemplifies a broadly humorous take on the woman soldier, with many nods and smirks, robbing the motif both of its inspirational side and also of any threat. We find this version also in 17th and 18th century ballads, and then revived in the middle and late 19th century in music hall numbers and semi-salacious cartoons in illustrated magazines and postcards. Like I love this one of the general here in her tunic. The Commune suddenly upped the stakes of the femme-soldat story. Women like Louise Michel, who fought on the barricades, were not patriotic heroines or titillating entertainment, not inspiring or comic, but deeply threatening to the gender order. Depicted as furies, harpies, unnatural monsters, beasts, as Gay Gullikson has argued, they embodied everything that had to be rejected and repressed in order to found the Republic. In the aftermath of the Commune, the French carried out this punishment for gender. As the Germans had raped and killed women warriors in fiction, the French carried this out for real after the Commune. The Commune weakened the femme-soldat story, but it didn't kill it off. In fact, in the late 19th century, we see a real revival of interest in women soldier stories of the past. Joan of Arc in particular, but also Jean Hachette, the 15th century axe-wielding heroine of Beauvais, seen in this 1851 statue. I had the impression that this statue was later, but it's actually from 1851. And also of Revolutionary War heroines. And there was a new woman warrior to add to this canon, Antoinette Lix, also known as Tony Lix, who had fought as a franc-tireur in the Franco-Prussian War. Brief accounts of her exploits appeared in the French press as early as December of 1870. In school books for girls published in the 1890s, recounted her story, and in 1906, Louise Zay gave her story full treatment in the prestigious journal La Revue des Deux Mondes. According to the story, Lix's father was an ex-grenadier and had raised her as a boy, teaching her to ride, to shoot, and to fence, and in some accounts even dressing her as a boy. As a young woman, she went to Poland as a governess in an aristocratic Polish family, and here in 1863 she became involved in the Polish rebellion against Russia. Disguised as a man, she commanded Polish cavalry until she was captured by the Russians, or gravely wounded, or perhaps both, it depends on what account you read, and her sex was discovered. Back in France in 1870, she led a company of franc-tireurs in heroic defense of Alsace, her homeland. Lix's story falls into two parts. The Polish episode follows the model of the Figure memoirs, an adventure story spiced with double entendres based on transvestism. Her exploits in the Franco-Prussian War, however, become serious and inspirational, and in a new development, maternal. Several accounts claim that Leeks volunteered in order to shame Frenchmen into doing their duty. Some deny that she wore trousers despite photographs of her in male attire. And although they acknowledge she did fire her gun, they describe her as more of a caregiver to her unit than a combatant. She assured they were fed and sheltered and bound up their wounds. One account insists that her most important weapons were her first aid kit and her crucifix. She soon withdrew from combat altogether and devoted herself to ambulance work, so the accounts say. And then these later accounts also add to the Polish episode that she mostly cared for the wounded. And then once back in France, quote, her untiring devotion and passion for sacrifice, end quote, inspired her to nurse during the cholera epidemic in Lille in 1866. So you get this really focusing on the nursing side aspect of the story. The traditional Femme-Soldat put off her femininity in order to fight, only to regain it again when her sex was discovered and she was discharged. But while this is true of most of the accounts of Leeks' exploits in Poland, it is not the case for her career in France. Here, Leeks never fully put off her womanly nature, remaining feminine, maternal, even while fighting. And her story is not unique in this regard. At the end of the 19th century, we see a similar feminization in retelling of the Femme-Soldat stories from the Revolutionary War. Liberté Darrow, for example, we learn once she returned from leading the charge, discovered that her husband, whom she thought was killed, in fact lived, and she immediately devoted herself to nursing him and other wounded soldiers. The story of the Fernig sisters was transformed into a love story between one of the sisters and a young officer that she saved from capture. Thérèse Figure's story was erased altogether when playwrights Victorien Sardou and Émile Moreau appropriated her sobriquet, Madame Saint-Jean, for their 1893 comedy about a wife of one of Napoleon's generals. So just she eliminates her story altogether. In the decades before the First World War, the Femme-Soldat was feminized, and she was also debunked. In 1897, Rudolf Vanière published a pamphlet labeling Virginie Guesquier's story a fiction, concocted, he argued, from a camp follower's boasts and puffed up to fit the needs of the moment. 1812, he said, quote, with the idea of firing military enthusiasm when it was starting to cool down in France, end quote. Archivist Léon Aîné similarly exposed Liberté Darrow's exploits as propaganda. Rather than leading the charge after her brother and husband were killed, or her brother killed and husband wounded, she collapsed in tears and was led off the battlefield. In Thérèse Figure's hometown, speaking supposedly to honor her, the mayor both domesticated her war service and debunked her claim to be a soldier. Rather than her battle exploits, he chose to remind his audience of her nursing and charity, and brought to light marriages prior to the one to a childhood sweetheart that she had talked about in her memoirs. Her two earlier marriages were to cavalrymen, and this implied that, like Guesquière and Barrault, she'd been a camp follower rather than a soldier. Prior to this period, Femme-Soldat stories had never been concerned with credibility. Young women left their homes, put on male clothing, and without effort or training became soldiers. They lived for weeks or months or years in close company of men without anyone discovering their sex. However, now some of these tales acquired embellishments to meet increasingly skeptical scrutiny. As we have seen, the tellers of Antoinette Leeks' story claimed she had been trained in military arts from a young age by her veteran father, this conveniently ignoring the fact that she had actually been schooled in a convent from age 11. So, you know, how we put those together, they never made clear. But anyway, we find nearly the same explanation added to Figure's story, that a soldier uncle had brought her up and taught her his trade. So the uncle sort of shows up late in the story, or late in the retellings of the story. The later tellings of Figure's tale make clear that although she wore male dress, she was not in disguise. Her fellow soldiers knew she was a woman, if sometimes people did not. And in Leeks' story, the male disguise was consigned to remote Poland. When serving in France as a franc-tireur, everyone knew she was a woman. The turn of the century saw a flurry of publications about Femme-Soldat, but at the same time doubt in their credibility. For example, writing to promote the Red Cross to French women and as their true wartime role, Drs. Arnaud and Bonnet skeptically reviewed the recently published anecdotes of women soldiers, claiming that most of them were legends from the dusty past. The only real modern women soldiers, they state, were the battalions of, quote, the battalions of women volunteers carrying old firearms who fought courageously for the commune. A grotesque pastiche of virile acts, unquote, obviously not worthy of admiration or emulation. The image of the communale was not the only cause for the devaluation of the Femme-Soldat story. Probably more important was the emergence by the turn of the century of a women's rights movement in France and proposals for women's suffrage that had included the claim that women citizens too had a duty to defend the fatherland. Now, as women entered public life and arguments for women's suffrage entered the mainstream discourse, the French fascination with the Femme-Soldat raised new questions. Authors of these stories in prefaces or conclusions now declare that the exploits they recounted are and must be curiosities of the past, neither appropriate nor needed in modern war. Feminization and skepticism came together and completely undermined the last of my Femme-Soldat tales. Set in the First World War, La Purdue was published first as a serial in the journal L'Œuvre, running from November 1915 to February 1916, and later published as a novel. It tells of a young woman who disguises herself as a soldier, serves her country undiscovered until a crisis reveals her sex in the classic way by exposing her breasts. It also includes a plot element typical of the fictions of this war, but new to the woman warrior story, spying. The heroine, Lina, a saleswoman in a Parisian fashion house, embarks on this adventure to warn her fiancé, Jean, a soldier at the front, that his best friend is a German spy. Despite the story's title, less than 100 pages of this 380-page novel are devoted to her experiences in the army. After a couple of preliminary chapters in which she devises her scheme to reach the front, the bulk of the novel is a long flashback to the trials and pleasures of young women working in the fashion industry. The novel's anonymous author, who claims to be a fashion house saleswoman like her heroine, makes some attempt to meet skeptical critics of the Femme-Soldat story. For example, to get her heroine over the obstacle of military bureaucracy, she has Lina conclude a deal with a lightly wounded young soldier who was home on leave. He gives her his uniform and papers, and his wound is to his ankle, which allows Lina to avoid a revealing physical when she returns to the front in his place. However, the author failed to devise a strategy to cope with Lina's lack of military training and familiarity with soldiers' lingo, as well as her own, that's the author's own ignorance of the experience of soldiers. Lina's war resembles a Boy Scout outing, hiking and storytelling around the campfire with one brief scene of combat. Quote, like the others, she fired, and threw handfuls of grenades, end quote, and concludes with immediately les Boches running away or putting up their hands in surrender. At the end, the author gives up and admits in Lina's thoughts that the reader's inevitable disbelief. Quote, all the same, if someone wrote my story, no one would believe it was true. It would not be accepted in a book. It's only good enough for a serial story. Thank you.